It was a Friday night in late October, the kind that settles over western Kentucky like a quilt stitched from cold air and chimney smoke. In the small town of Ridgeview, folks gathered for the one thing that made everyone forget their troubles for a couple hours: high school football under tall lights that hummed against the dark. The stands were packed shoulder to shoulder, and the smell of popcorn drifted across the field like a memory you couldn't quite shake loose. When the final whistle echoed between the hills, most of the crowd spilled toward their trucks or the diner down on Main. But four teenagers lingered a little longer near the concession stand, unwilling to let the night end. Evan Walker, 17, quiet but quick with a grin, tossed his pickup keys in the air like he always did when he was happy. His best friend, Jordan Hale, a year older and loudly confident in ways that made adults sigh and teammates laugh, nudged him and joked about his driving. Mia Carter, honor roll kid, head of the yearbook committee, the one who somehow managed to cheer for everyone, wrapped her scarf tighter and teased both of them. And Claire Eaton, soft-spoken and artistic, stood nearby clutching her sketchbook against the cold. The four of them had grown up on the same street since kindergarten, their lives stitched together through church picnics, little league teams, shared secrets, and summer nights spent down by the river. Tonight wasn't anything special. It was just a celebration of another home win, the silly kind of freedom you feel when you're 17 and the whole world is a long stretch of road you think you understand. When they finally piled into Evan's blue 1989 Chevy Blazer, it was just past 9:30. Their plan was simple: take the long way home, swing by the diner for pie if they felt like it, then head back through town. But somewhere between joking and arguing about whose playlist was better, Jordan suggested the shortcut. Everyone in Ridgeview knew about Black Hollow Road, though most folks avoided it after dark. It cut straight through old mining land, one-lane dirt turns, dips in the road that disappeared under fog, places where the woods pressed so close to the gravel that your headlights barely had room to breathe. People had stories about that road. Near misses, broken axles, hunters who said the silence there felt strange, unnatural. But to four kids who'd explored those woods a dozen times, it didn't feel like danger. It felt like adventure. They'd taken that same shortcut earlier in the summer to watch fireflies scatter across the ridge like sparks from a match. It didn't seem like a big decision, just another road they already knew. Their last confirmed stop came minutes later at Raymond's Gas and Supply off Route 12. The owner, Ray Lanning, would later tell officers that the teens came in around 9:42. He remembered it clearly because they were laughing so loudly he had to ask them twice if they were paying with cash or card. They bought sodas, chips, a pack of gum. Evan asked if the back road past Hollow Creek still looped around and connected with Highway 52. Ray said it did, as long as they took the left turn after the old iron bridge. Then they thanked him, walked out into the chill night air, and drove off. That was the last time anyone in Ridgeview saw them alive. By midnight, Evan's parents assumed he'd crashed at Jordan's house. Jordan's parents thought the same, but in reverse. Mia's mother drove the route twice, stacking at every pull-off, calling her daughter's name through the dark. Claire's dad checked the sheriff's office before sunrise, hoping maybe the kids had gotten pulled over for curfew. No one wanted to imagine anything worse. When the sun finally climbed over the ridge Saturday morning, the truth came into focus with brutal clarity. None of the kids had returned home. Their beds were undisturbed. Cooper, Evan's dog, paced by the front door all night, whining at sounds only he could hear. By 6 a.m., the Ridgeview Sheriff's Office officially declared them missing. Word spread quickly in a town where news travels faster than wind through an open cornfield. Volunteers gathered at the high school parking lot, still bundled in yesterday's jackets, carrying flashlights and thermoses of coffee. The sheriff's deputies unpacked topo maps across the hood of a patrol truck and tried to sketch out every possible route the teens could have taken from the football field to their homes. The land around Ridgeview didn't make searching easy. Dense woods tangled with underbrush, narrow ravines carved deep by decades of runoff. Dozens of unmarked paths left behind from coal trucks that hadn't run in years. Search teams moved through the terrain calling names that disappeared into the hollows before anyone could hear an answer. For 3 days, nobody found anything that truly helped. A crushed soda can near a creek bed, tire tracks that led nowhere, a piece of flannel caught on a thorn bush that could have belonged to any hunter. Helicopters scanned from above, K9 units combed the forest floor, but the woods swallowed sound and scent like it was hungry for both. False leads came and went. Someone thought they saw a blue SUV near a quarry. Another person reported 4 kids walking near a rest stop hours away. Every rumor dissolved the moment officers investigated. By Sunday night, a candlelight vigil formed in the high school bleachers. Parents clutched photos that fluttered in the cold wind. Teachers cried quietly. Nobody spoke above a whisper. There are towns where hope breaks all at once, and towns where it dies slowly like embers fading into ash. Ridgeview was the second kind. When reporters from Lexington arrived the following week, they filmed the fog rolling across Devil's Bend, the muddy trails searchers had walked 100 times, and the faces of a town trying not to fall apart. The story made headlines for a few days before fading under newer tragedies somewhere else. But in Ridgeview, the silence stayed. And somewhere out on Black Hollow Road in the thick woods that locals swore always felt wrong after midnight, there were people who claimed they saw faint headlights flicker between the trees before disappearing all at once. At the time, no one took that seriously. Years later, investigators would wish they had. By the following morning, Ridgeview felt like a town holding its breath. Sheriff Harold Crane, a man who'd spent decades dealing with lost hikers, overturned tractors, and the occasional drunken brawl at the county fair, was out before the sun. He stood at the edge of Black Hollow Road, hands on his hips, staring into the kind of darkness that didn't look empty, it looked patient. Deputies loaded mapping gear into SUVs while the state police helicopter circled overhead. From above, the woods looked endless, a thick blanket of pine and oak draped over the hills, hiding every twist of the narrow roads beneath. Even from the air, Black Hollow Road blended into the forest like something trying not to be found. By mid-morning, volunteers arrived in droves. Farmers in muddy boots, teachers still wearing their school IDs, teenagers from the football team who refused to sit at home doing nothing. They brought bottled water, flashlights, and an exhaustion that hadn't yet caught up with them. The sheriff divided everyone into groups: creek teams, ridge teams, road sweepers. They trudged through brush so tall it scraped their coats, calling out the teenagers' names until their voices cracked. Every shout echoed, then died. Creek beds swallowed boot prints faster than deputies could mark them. Thick mud clutched at ankles. The air smelled of wet leaves, rusting metal, and something colder: hopelessness trying to settle in early. By afternoon, crews reached the 12-mile mark on Hollow Creek Road, where the pavement gave way to gravel and eventually dirt. The deeper they went, the quieter the woods grew. Even birds seemed to avoid the place. One of the deputies muttered that the woods didn't just stay silent, they listened. Late that day, they found it. A section of old wooden guardrail hanging over a ravine, splintered and broken. It looked fresh at a glance, like something heavy might have crashed through. Word spread through the search crews in minutes. For the first time since dawn, people moved with purpose, hearts pounding in their chests. Floodlights were hauled in. Ropes were secured around thick tree trunks. Rescue teams rappelled down the 200-foot drop, boots scraping rock as they descended into a swampy mess of mud and stagnant water. The ravine floor was a graveyard of old mining scrap, rusted barrels, twisted metal, and tangled weeds. Searchers waded knee-deep through black mud, probing with long poles. Every clang of metal against something hidden beneath the water made everyone hold their breath, but each time it was just abandoned machinery, long forgotten. No truck, no teens, no answers. Sheriff Crane's face tightened, but he didn't say a word. By midnight, he ordered the teams back up.
They were soaked, shivering, and empty-handed. The broken guardrail that had sparked a glimmer of hope turned out to be nothing more than rotted wood giving way after years of rain and neglect. It hadn't been hit by anything, not recently, maybe not ever. Still, people placed flowers there the next day. Parents came and tied ribbons to the jagged posts. Reporters filmed the spot, and locals drove out just to stand quietly at the edge of the ravine, imagining what might have happened. Days passed, then weeks, and hope frayed thread by thread. False sightings continued to roll in. A blue truck parked near an abandoned barn turned out to be an old Ford with no engine. A caller claimed to see 4 kids at a rest stop outside town, but cameras showed nothing. Every new lead dissolved as quickly as it appeared. At the high school, students held vigils every Friday night. Some cried, some prayed. Some stood in silence because words didn't fit anymore. Posters of the 4 teenagers hung on grocery store doors, gas pumps, restaurant windows, faces slowly fading under layers of rain and sun. By the end of the second week, the scent of fall shifted toward winter. The air felt sharper. Searchers began wearing heavier coats. Deputies walked slower. They weren't giving up, they just didn't know where else to look. Sheriff Crane stood on a ridge near Hollow Creek one evening, staring across miles of untouched forest. Somewhere out there, he believed, was the blazer. But without tracks, debris, a skid mark, or even a broken branch to follow, he felt like he was chasing ghosts. The forest below seemed endless, unmapped, and unwilling to offer anything back. As December settled over Ridgeview, the flyers on telephone poles browned and curled. Snow came early that year, covering the hills with a quiet white blanket that made the woods look peaceful, even though everyone knew they weren't. At Christmas services, entire pews cried while carols played softly in the background. No presents were wrapped in 4 homes. Instead, families sat in living rooms staring at empty chairs, listening for footsteps they knew wouldn't come. Then, as the new year approached, a strange detail emerged, one that investigators had dismissed at the start. A man driving home from a late shift swore he saw faint headlights flickering in the trees near Hollow Creek just past 10:30 that night. Not moving, not drifting, just flickering. Then they vanished. At the time, the sheriff chalked it up to fog playing tricks or a hunter's ATV. But years later, investigators would reopen that statement and study it with a different question in mind. What if the headlights weren't an illusion? What if they were the last sign of 4 teenagers fighting to stay visible in the dark? For now, though Ridgeview slid into a quiet grief, students grew older, teachers retired, new families moved in unaware of the weight hanging over the town. But the story of the missing teens, the Ridgeview Four as they came to be called, never faded. Parents warned their kids to avoid shortcuts. Hunters refused to enter the woods after sundown. People drove slower around Devil's Bend, even in broad daylight. And deep in the sheriff's evidence room, a thick case file sat untouched on a shelf. The pages inside held interviews, maps, tips, sightings, all the pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. Nobody knew then that it would stay that way for more than a decade. Nobody knew that the woods, quiet and patient, were simply waiting for the right storm to bring the truth back up. But fate has a way of circling around. 13 years later, in a muddy pasture less than 2 miles from where the ravine search had taken place, a farmer's tractor hit something buried beneath the soil. Metal, solid, and blue. The earth had finally begun to give something back.
Spring in Ridgeview usually arrived quietly. Rain tapping on barn roofs, the smell of wet soil drifting across the fields, tractors humming in the distance. But in April of 2006, on a morning heavy with fog, the quiet broke. Howard Darnell, a farmer who had worked the same stretch of land for more than 30 years, drove his tractor across his south pasture to clear fallen branches after a night of storms. Rain had cut thin channels through the mud, carving the ground in unpredictable ways. Howard had seen washouts before, but as he eased the tractor forward, the right rear tire abruptly sank deeper than expected. He swore under his breath, climbed down, and stepped into mud that swallowed half his boot. A shallow depression spread out before him, wide, sunken, and oddly smooth, as if the earth had shifted rather than collapsed. He'd meant to repair the drainage there years ago, but like many farm chores, it had slipped down the list. Howard grabbed a shovel from the trailer and began digging around his tire to give the machine room to pull free. But on his third scoop, the metal blade struck something hard. The sound wasn't right. It wasn't rock. It had a hollow thud, like hitting a steel drum. He knelt, brushing away mud with the edge of his glove. A curved surface emerged. Smooth, metallic. A faint hint of dark blue glinted through the grime. At first, he figured it was some old scrap left behind by the mining company that once leased the land. But the shape didn't match anything he recognized. It had contours, angles, a hood-like slope that made his stomach tighten with a feeling he didn't want to name. Howard stepped back and stared at the soft ground around him. He wasn't a man who panicked easily. Years of working sunup to sundown had hardened him, but something about that patch of earth felt wrong, like whatever lay beneath had been waiting to be found. He climbed back into the tractor and drove straight to the county sheriff's office. By the time deputies arrived to inspect the site, clouds had rolled in again, promising more rain. They marked off the area with stakes and tape, and the next morning a recovery crew arrived with pumps and a backhoe. As they drained standing water from the depression, the outline of a vehicle slowly appeared beneath the mud. First the roof, then the rear bumper, then the unmistakable curve of a Blazer body frame. A hush fell over the crew. Nobody wanted to be the first to say it, but everyone knew what they were looking at. The 1989 Chevy Blazer, the same blue one that had vanished with Evan, Jordan, Mia, and Claire 13 years earlier. Word spread through Ridgeview in a matter of hours. People who had avoided saying the teenagers' names aloud for over a decade found them on their tongues again. Neighbors stopped at the Darnell property line, whispering prayers or simply staring, pale and stunned, at the field that had kept it secret for so long. The recovery took 2 full days. Mud sucked at the equipment like it didn't want to let go. The crane lifted the vehicle inch by inch from the pit, the Blazer dripping with black water and clay. Even after more than a decade underground, its shape was mostly intact, though crushed inward as if the earth had slowly tightened its grip over the years. When investigators finally pried open the doors, a wave of cold metallic air drifted out. Inside sat 4 skeletal remains, 1 in the driver's seat, 3 in the back. Each was still belted in. Bits of decayed clothing clung to the bones, a scrap of denim, a faded strip of red flannel, the rusted clasp of a hair barrette that looked heartbreakingly familiar. The gear shift was in neutral. The parking brake was off, and though the wiring had long corroded, the switch for the headlights was still flipped on.
Sheriff Crane, retired but never truly away from the case, came to the site as soon as he heard. He stood behind the tape, hands trembling. It wasn't just grief or shock. It was the heavy recognition of something he'd suspected all along. "How does a truck slide into a pit with the headlights on?" he murmured, "and nobody hear a thing?" What troubled him more was the location. Howard's pasture sat less than 2 miles from where the search had focused 13 years earlier. The ravine with the broken guardrail, the one everyone assumed led nowhere, was just across Hollow Creek, practically within shouting distance of the pasture. For years, that land had appeared solid, but storms, runoff, and erosion had slowly hidden the natural sinkhole beneath layers of mud. Over time, the ground had smoothed out completely, leaving no sign that anything waited just below the surface. As forensic teams photographed and cataloged everything inside the blazer, investigators found small but haunting details: a football helmet keychain belonging to Evan, a melted cassette tape with an unreadable label, and a strap from Claire's canvas backpack. A wristwatch was found on the passenger side floor, its cracked face frozen at 10:47 p.m. When the remains were sent for examination, DNA confirmed what everyone already feared. The Ridgeview Four had been found. The discovery should have brought closure. Instead, it cracked the entire case open again, because as forensic examiners began analyzing the truck and the bones inside, they found details that didn't match a simple crash. 3 skulls showed fracture patterns inconsistent with a single impact. Jordan's hyoid bone, a small U-shaped bone in the neck, was broken, the kind of break examiners usually saw in cases of strangulation. And the Blazer's tires weren't just rotted, they were slashed. Deep, clean cuts that had been made with a sharp blade long before the truck went into the ground. Someone had tampered with the vehicle. Someone had hurt those kids before the Blazer was ever rolled into the pit. Ridgeview went quiet again, but not with grief this time, with suspicion. Old theories resurfaced, old fears reawakened. For the first time since 1993, investigators weren't asking, where did they go? They were asking something much darker. Who put them there? And as forensic teams dug deeper, a name began surfacing in old reports. A name everyone in town knew. A name tied to the land where the kids had last been seen. Gary Walker, Evan's uncle. The case was no longer a tragedy. It was a crime, and the truth, long buried, had begun to claw its way into the light.
The discovery of the Blazer changed everything. What had haunted Ridgeview for years as a tragic mystery suddenly shifted into something far more chilling. The sheriff's office reopened old files, pulled dusty boxes from storage, and converted them into digital records. Detectives gathered in cramped rooms lit by overhead fluorescents, studying every forgotten detail as if the answers were hiding in the margins. One of the first things they found was a witness statement taken 2 days after the teens vanished, barely glanced at back in 1993. The report came from Ralph Denning, a truck driver who lived along the far edge of Hollow Creek Road. He told deputies that sometime around 10:30 that night, he heard shouting in the woods, angry shouting, followed by an engine revving hard before suddenly cutting out. At the time, deputies had assumed it was teenagers partying near the abandoned mine road. When they found no tracks or trash, the tip got buried beneath stronger leads. Now, that old account looked like a red flag they all missed. Detectives compared Denning's statement to the new forensic findings: slashed tires, multiple skull fractures. The timing of the watch stopped at 10:47 p.m. All of it lined up more neatly than anyone wanted to admit. But the most damning connection came from land records. A worn property map revealed that the stretch of forest near Hollow Creek, the area the teens would have passed through if they took the shortcut, was once owned by Gary Walker, Evan's uncle. His house sat just a short walk beyond the old mine access road. In the early investigation, his name had appeared only once. He'd told deputies he wasn't home the night the kids disappeared, claiming he'd been working an out-of-town contracting job. At the time, nobody questioned him. He was family, and grief made people blind. But now, looking back, there were details no one could ignore. Gary sold that land less than a year after the disappearance, quietly, quickly, and within months he vanished from the county records, relocating to Ohio without leaving a forwarding address. Investigators secured a warrant to search the old property, now owned by a private timber company. A small team hiked through thick brush, following what remained of the old access trail. The air felt stale, heavy with mildew.
Dead branches snapped under their boots. Deep in the woods, they found it. A collapsed maintenance shed made of rusting corrugated metal. It leaned to one side like it was trying to sink into the earth. Inside, the floor was littered with tools, broken parts, chains, and an old tarp stiffened by age. Near the rear wall, under a partially caved-in shelf, they found something that made every person in that shed go still. Small, jagged strips of rubber, black, thick, with cuts so precise they could only have been made by a blade. Forensics later confirmed what everyone already suspected. The rubber matched the tire material from a 1989 Chevy Blazer. Same thickness, same composition, same aging pattern. Just outside the shed, half buried under dry leaves, investigators found something else. A twisted chunk of a front vehicle grille. Rusted nearly beyond recognition, but the pattern was unmistakable. It came from a late 80s Chevy Blazer. The pieces were falling into place, each one pointing in the same direction. Back at the sheriff's office, families were brought in to hear the news. Some nodded in grim silence. Some shook. Some wept with the kind of rage that hurts to hear. For 13 years, they'd believed the kids had taken a wrong turn or hit a patch of fog too thick to see through. They never imagined someone they knew, someone connected to their children, might have been the reason they never came home. When word spread through Ridgeview, it rippled like electricity.
People remembered things they hadn't spoken of in years. A neighbor said Gary used to chase off anyone who wandered near his property. A former coworker recalled seeing dents in the side of Gary's truck weeks after the kids went missing. Someone else claimed he'd been acting strangely in church around that time. Quiet, fidgeting, avoiding eye contact. Rumors mixed with truth until nobody could tell them apart. But behind all the noise, one fact stood firm. The evidence was no longer accidental. It was criminal. The Kentucky State Police assigned 2 senior investigators to the case. Their first stop was Columbus, Ohio, where Gary now lived in a modest beige house on the edge of town. They approached him politely, intending only to revisit his 1993 statement. But the moment they mentioned the recovered Blazer and the slashed tires, something shifted in his expression. He rubbed his hands together, palms trembling. Sweat gathered at his temples. Then they showed him photographs of the shed, the rubber fragments, the grill. He stared at the pictures for a long time, jaw tight, breathing uneven. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. It wasn't supposed to happen. It wasn't supposed to go that way. The confession that followed came slowly, in trembling fragments, as if each piece cost him something. He described being home that night, drunk, angry, paranoid. He claimed teenagers often trespassed on his property, stealing gas cans or tools. So when he saw headlights near the ridge, he grabbed a wrench and a flashlight, storming out to confront whoever was there. He didn't know it was Evan's truck until he got close. He said the kids laughed at him, thought he was joking. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But tempers flared, words turned sharp. Someone grabbed his arm. He couldn't remember who. And in a moment of blind panic, he swung the wrench. He said he only hit one of them, but when the sound echoed through the trees and Evan fell, the others screamed. They tried to run. He tried to stop them, telling them it was an accident, that he didn't mean it, that everything would be fine if they just calmed down. Fear had a way of twisting itself into something colder. Gary claimed he panicked. He said he hadn't checked pulses, hadn't wanted to know whether they were alive or not. Instead, he loaded them into the Blazer, drove it to the lowest point on his land, the pit left behind from mining runoff, and slashed all 4 tires before rolling the truck forward. The headlights were left on, the gear shift in neutral. He watched it sink until the beams faded beneath the black water. Then he went home and drank until morning. When he finished his confession, he didn't look at the detectives.
He kept his eyes fixed on the floor like he expected it to swallow him too. Gary Walker was placed under arrest and charged with multiple counts of manslaughter and evidence tampering. He offered no resistance. Back in Ridgeview, the town split down familiar lines: anger, disbelief, grief, vindication. For some families, the truth hurt worse than the not knowing. For others, the answer was a wound reopening too late to ever heal right. But justice, slow and stubborn, had finally found a direction, and it was pointing straight at a man who'd lived among them, a man they once trusted, a man who buried the truth along with 4 kids who never made it home.
When news of Gary Walker's arrest broke, Ridgeview didn't react with celebration or relief. It reacted with a kind of stunned quiet. There are truths people brace themselves for, and then there are truths that hit like a blow to the ribs, leaving you breathless, unsteady, unsure where to put your hands or your thoughts. For 13 years, people had built entire narratives around the disappearance of the Ridgeview Four. Some believed it had been an accident. Others believed the kids had simply taken a turn too sharp or hit a patch of fog too thick for headlights to cut through. A few whispered darker theories: strangers, drifters, people passing through. But almost nobody imagined the real explanation was something so painfully close: a relative. Someone the kids knew. Someone they would have rolled down a window for. In the days after the confession, the sheriff's office was flooded with calls, some from reporters, some from locals, some from people offering theories that didn't matter anymore. Sheriff Crane, now in his 70s and moving slower than he once did, came to the station anyway. He didn't need to be told what to do. He'd lived with this case as long as anyone. He spent hours reading the newly typed transcripts, listening to recorded statements, and comparing them with notes he'd written by hand back in 1993. He didn't say much to the younger deputies, but every so often he let out a heavy sigh, the kind that came not from surprise, but from the weight of long-held suspicion finally finding confirmation. There had always been something about the night that didn't sit right with him, something about the lack of tracks, the missing signs of panic, the absence of debris. Roads don't just swallow cars without leaving scars, but the land where the blazer was found wasn't a road. It was a pit, one that nature had quietly stitched over year after year until nobody could tell it existed. If the tractor hadn't hit metal, that secret would have stayed buried forever. Meanwhile, forensics continued examining the blazer in a secure facility outside Lexington. Under sterile lights, technicians brushed away layers of clay that clung to the truck like a second skin. Every scrape of a tool revealed something new: bent frame rails, corrosion patterns, bits of decayed seat fabric. But the most haunting discoveries came from the interior. Fragments of a friendship, frozen in time. A ticket stub tucked between the back seats from a football game that none of them ever got to talk about again. A crushed can of soda with the expiration year still faintly visible. And tucked near the driver's side floor, behind a jumble of rust and wires, an old disposable camera. Cracked, but with the film still sealed inside. When the photos were developed, they were foggy, overexposed, and warped from years underground. But one picture came out clear enough to recognize. The 4 teenagers stood in the high school parking lot, arms around each other, grinning at the camera. Evan held the keys up like a trophy. Mia had her eyes closed mid-laugh. Claire leaned into Jordan, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. It was the last photograph ever taken of them. Investigators placed it with the case evidence, but word of it got out anyway, spreading through Ridgeview like a gust of wind hitting every door at once. The image felt like a wound reopening, and a reminder of what had been stolen. While forensic teams worked, prosecutors began building their case. Gary's confession was detailed, but legally fragile. Defense attorneys would argue intoxication, panic, memory gaps. They would say that the confession alone wasn't enough. But the evidence spoke clearly. The slashed tires,
the skull fractures, the hyoid bone break. The vehicle rolled intentionally into a sinkhole. The rubber fragments found in Gary's shed. The chunk of blazer grill buried near the tree line. Piece by piece, the past built its foundation. The timing of the watch stopped at 10:47, matched the witness who had heard shouting around 10:30. The headlights left on matched the last sighting from the driver who swore he had seen lights flickering in the trees. The story unfolded with the kind of brutal simplicity investigators dread, because it meant nothing about that night had ever been supernatural, mysterious, or unknowable. It had been painfully, tragically human. Gary's own family struggled under the weight of the revelation. Evan's mother, who had once hugged Gary during vigils, collapsed when detectives explained the evidence. She had spent years imagining her brother-in-law grieving with them. She never imagined he had been carrying something entirely else.
Neighbors who had grown up knowing Gary as a quiet man with a temper he kept mostly under control couldn't reconcile the confession with the person they remembered. But people change behind closed doors, and sometimes a single moment, one mistake, one violent impulse reverberates for decades. After weeks of preparation, Kentucky State Police transported Gary to Ridgeview for arraignment. Residents gathered outside the courthouse, some holding candles, some holding photos of the teens, some holding nothing at all. They didn't yell or chant. They just stood silently as he was led inside, wrists cuffed, head lowered, looking smaller than anyone remembered. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a man who had finally run out of places to hide. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere crackled with tension. Families sat in the front rows, shoulders rigid, faces pale and drawn. Sheriff Crane took a seat along the aisle, hands folded tightly. Even the air felt heavy. When Gary was asked to enter a plea, he hesitated. For a moment, the room held still. Then he cleared his throat and said the words softly, as if they cost him something to say. Guilty. Gasps broke through the quiet. A few people sobbed, others bowed their heads. It wasn't justice, not yet, but it was acknowledgement. It was truth spoken aloud after 13 years of silence. For legal reasons, the trial that followed focused not on the confession itself, but on the evidence supporting it. Prosecutors walked the jury through the forensic analysis, the property findings, the autopsy results. They showed maps of the land, diagrams of the blazer's position, timelines reconstructed with painstaking precision. Jurors listened, shaken, as the pieces aligned into a timeline that left little room for doubt. After a short deliberation, the verdict was delivered. Guilty. On all counts. Gary Walker was sentenced to 25 years in state prison. He would be an old man by the time he was eligible for parole. Outside the courthouse, the families gathered quietly. They weren't celebrating, they weren't relieved, they were simply breathing, slowly, painfully, but finally with truth instead of questions. Sheriff Crane stood at the edge of the steps, staring out at the ridge in the distance. For years, the land had held its secret. Now that the truth was out, the hills looked different somehow. Still quiet, still solemn, but no longer waiting. Justice, however imperfect, had finally reached Ridgeview. But closure wasn't as simple as a verdict, and for some, the hardest part was still ahead.
The trial ended, but Ridgeview didn't suddenly return to normal. Closure doesn't wash over a town like a spring rain. It comes in small, strange moments. An empty locker finally being cleaned out, a mother driving past the football stadium without pulling over, a teacher catching herself calling roll and pausing at a name that isn't there anymore. For weeks after the verdict, the town moved in a kind of slow-motion silence. People reopened shops, dropped their kids off at school, waved at neighbors from porches. But beneath the daily routines lay a tension you could almost feel in the air, like a storm that had passed but left the humidity behind. The families of the Ridgeview Four each carried the truth differently. Evan's mother stopped attending church for a while. She couldn't bring herself to sit in the same pews where Gary had once prayed alongside them. She told a neighbor that it felt like grief had split itself into two pieces, losing her son and losing the version of her brother-in-law she believed existed. Jordan's father, a quiet man who coached basketball every winter, sat in his truck outside the courthouse for nearly an hour after the verdict. He never talked about that day, but his wife said something in him softened afterward. Like anger had been holding him upright for 13 years, and now that it was gone, he didn't know how to stand anymore. Mia's mother kept her daughter's bedroom exactly as it was the night she disappeared. Pillows fluffed, perfume bottles lined in a neat row, her cross-country medals hanging from the dresser mirror. She said the truth didn't make the room feel any more empty, it just made the silence inside it make sense. Claire's dad spent afternoons walking along Hollow Creek Road, glancing toward the ridge where the blazer had been pushed into the pit. Sometimes he brought flowers. Sometimes he brought nothing. He said he wasn't visiting a site of death. He was visiting the last place the world had still been whole. On the outskirts of town, the Darnell pasture became a strange kind of memorial. Not official, not marked, but visited. Locals stopped by with flowers, photographs, or handwritten notes that the wind eventually carried away. The timber company agreed not to develop that section of the land for the foreseeable future. Too many people needed it to remain untouched. Sheriff Harold Crane visited the property too, though rarely when others were around. He walked the perimeter slowly, hands shoved into his coat pockets, head bowed. His career had ended officially years before, but he'd never fully left the case. It lived in his thoughts, in the ache of old files, and the night calls he once answered when hope was still alive. He told one of the deputies that the land felt different now. Not lighter, not healed, just different. Like a breath had finally been released after being held too long. In the weeks following the sentencing, the forensic teams finished their final reports. The details were grim, clinical, written in language that didn't soften any edges. But the facts mattered and the families needed them, even when they hurt. The slashed tires matched a utility knife found in Gary's old shed. The skull fractures aligned with the blow from a heavy tool. The hyoid bone break indicated strangulation or neck compression inconsistent with a vehicle accident. The neutral gear shift and light switched on supported a manual roll into the pit. The mud layering on the blazer proved it had been submerged immediately, not slowly over time. The evidence showed the truth starkly. What happened that night wasn't a freak accident or an unlucky turn on a bad road. It was violence, confusion, panic, and then a cover-up. 13 years of maybe hardened into a single painful understanding. As spring turned into summer, Ridgeview began to stitch itself back together, quietly, clumsily, imperfectly. Life in small towns doesn't stop, not even for tragedy. Kids rode bikes through neighborhoods. The high school football team started practice with 4 new scholarships hanging in the locker room as a memorial. Local churches held community dinners for the families. People tried to move forward while carrying what remained behind them. But healing didn't look the same for everyone. Some residents avoided Hollow Creek Road entirely, convinced the land itself held a curse. Others drove it more often, as if checking to make sure nothing else could go wrong there. A few teenagers turned the side of the pit into a dare, only until their parents found out and shut that down brutally fast.
A group of teachers from Ridgeview High raised funds for a small memorial garden beside the school. A bench bearing the names Evan Walker, Jordan Hale, Mia Carter, and Claire Eaton was placed near the flagpole, surrounded by 4 oak saplings. Students painted stones with their initials and left them in rows along the path. During the dedication ceremony, the principal spoke softly about memory, community, and how grief can shape a place without defining it. There were tears, but also laughter. Small moments, brief and bittersweet, when people shared stories of the kids they had once known so well. Claire's art teacher told a story about how Claire used to draw birds in the margins of her math homework. Jordan's coach recalled how the boy once drove him crazy by talking during laps, but always ran them anyway. Mia's English teacher remembered her love for stories with hopeful endings. And Evan's shop teacher said he'd never seen anyone fix an engine as fast as that boy could when he put his mind to it.
Those stories became part of Ridgeview's fabric. People repeated them at barbecues, at fundraisers, at family gatherings. They became the pieces of life the tragedy couldn't take away. But even as the town healed, a quiet unease remained. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something older. An awareness that a moment of rage on a dark road had rearranged the lives of everyone connected to it. Some people asked why Gary hadn't come forward sooner. Others wondered how many nights he sat awake waiting for the land to betray him. A few said they'd always sensed something off about him, though memories have a way of reshaping themselves once the truth is known. Gary himself rarely spoke after the sentencing. When a journalist later requested an interview from the state prison, he declined. The only statement he made was through his attorney, "I accept what the court decided." Whether that acceptance was remorse or resignation, nobody knew. Summer drifted into fall, and leaves changed above the ridge where everything had begun 13 years earlier. The road remained the same, still narrow, still winding, still bordered by trees that leaned inward like they were whispering to each other. People said the woods felt quieter now, but not empty, as if they remembered too. Ridgeview wasn't the same town it had been back in 1993. The landscape had changed, families had aged, but the story that once existed only in rumor and fear now had an ending. A hard one, a painful one, but an ending. Even so, there was one last piece of the story left to tell, one that didn't belong to investigators, or jurors, or even the families. It belonged to the land itself, to what was left behind after the truth surfaced. And it would shape Ridgeview's understanding of that night in a way no courtroom ever could.
The following winter, the hills around Ridgeview took on the same stark, quiet beauty they always had. Bare oaks stretching toward a pale sky, frost collecting on fence rails, the creek running slow beneath thin sheets of ice. But for the first time in 13 years, the land no longer felt weighed down by secrets. The pit where the blazer had been found was filled in and leveled, but the earth there remained noticeably darker, richer from years of holding what it shouldn't have had to hold. Locals said the soil felt different underfoot, softer, almost hollow, as if the ground still remembered. And maybe it did, because memory isn't just something people carry. Places carry it too. In early December, shortly after the sentencing, the families asked Sheriff Harold Crane to join them for a small gathering near the Darnell pasture. Snow pushed lightly across the field that morning, swirling like dust in slow motion. They didn't want a crowd or a ceremony. They just wanted to stand in the place where truth had finally surfaced. Crane hesitated when he got the invitation. He wasn't a man who liked being the center of anything, especially not grief. But he'd spent half his career walking those woods, searching for answers that always seemed a ridge away. And something in him needed to be there, needed to see the ending through, even if endings rarely felt like closure. The families met at the edge of the field, bundled in coats and scarves, breath fogging in the cold air. They didn't bring speeches or flowers. They didn't need them. They were there to be present, nothing more. To stand on the land that had carried their worst fears for so long. Evan's mother was the first to walk toward the filled-in pit. She stepped carefully, pausing halfway as if the ground itself might crack open under her feet. Then she placed her hand over her heart and whispered something nobody else could hear. Jordan's father joined her, then Mia's mother, Claire's dad. One by one, they approached the spot where the past had finally let go. Crane stayed back, hands in his jacket pockets. He wasn't sure he belonged in that moment, but the families waved him over, gently insisting. At first, he resisted. Polite shaking of the head, reluctant steps. But their persistence softened him, and eventually he walked forward, boot prints sinking slightly in the damp soil. When he reached them, nobody spoke. They just stood together in a quiet circle, letting the snowfall blur the edges of memory. For Crane, it wasn't closure. It wasn't peace. It was simply truth, stark and cold like the winter morning around them. He looked out across the ridge toward the narrow sliver of road where everything had begun that night. And he pictured 4 teenagers laughing at a gas station, unaware of the nightmare waiting around the bend. And for a moment, he let himself feel the weight of all the years spent searching in the wrong places.
He exhaled slowly. The woods kept their secret, he murmured, until they were ready to give it back. Nobody responded, but the silence around them shifted, less heavy, less suffocating. Maybe they felt it too. In town, life continued in subtle ways. The high school retired the Ridgeview Four's jersey numbers and planted a small plaque near the football field, in memory of Evan Walker, Jordan Hale, Mia Erder, and Claire Eaton. Students placed candles beside it after games. Seniors left flowers on graduation day. A scholarship fund was created in the teens' names, one for engineering, one for athletics, one for writing, and one for art. The first recipients cried when they accepted, understanding the weight of having their names tied to lives cut too short. The sheriff's department kept the case file open only long enough to archive it properly. The final pages held crime scene photos, transcripts, forensic diagrams, but also small, quieter things. Notes from volunteers who had searched for days, journal entries from Crane's old notebooks, a copy of the photograph recovered from the disposable camera, showing the 4 teens smiling into a future they didn't get to reach. When the file was sealed, Crane ran his fingertips across the cover, as if he could feel the 13 years locked inside. Then he slid it onto the shelf, not to forget it, but because it finally had a place to rest. As the first anniversary of the discovery approached, Ridgeview gathered at the high school. People came quietly. Teachers who'd retired, classmates with their own children now, residents who had lived through the long years of uncertainty. The gym lights hummed softly above, warming the cold December air. A student choir hummed a slow hymn. Families sat together, hands intertwined. At the front of the room, the principal didn't give a speech. Instead, she told the story of the last home game the teens ever attended. The laughter, the victory chants, the way Evan tossed his keys, the way Mia cheered for players she barely knew, the way Claire drew quick sketches of everything around her, the way Jordan joked about driving, even though everyone knew Evan would never let him behind the wheel. People smiled through tears, because grief isn't just sorrow, it's remembering. After the ceremony, the family stepped outside to the edge of the football field. Snow had begun falling again, light flakes swirling under the bright stadium lights. For a moment, the entire field looked like it was glowing. Mia's mother reached up and let the snow land on her palm. "You think they'd like this?" she asked softly. Claire's dad nodded. "I think they'd want us to be here, together." A hush settled over the field. The scoreboard behind them, long blank, flickered as if trying to come to life. The wind pushed gently through the bleachers, carrying with it the faint echo of band music and crowd applause, sounds from a night frozen in memory. No one spoke for many minutes. They didn't need to. They had lived 13 years waiting for answers that finally came, and now the only thing left to do was let the truth settle into its place. When they finally turned to leave, Sheriff Crane lingered one last time. He looked at the field, the ridge beyond it, and the dark line of Black Hollow Road disappearing into the trees. There were no ghosts, no legends, no curses, just a story with roots deep in the land, a story about rage, fear, mistakes, and the silent weight of things buried too long. As he started walking away, he paused and glanced back. Some people say that on certain nights when fog drifts low and the creek runs fast, you can still see faint glimmers of light near the ridge where the blazer once went into the earth. Maybe it's reflection, maybe it's imagination, or Maybe it's just the land remembering 4 young lives that passed through it. Whether it's true or not doesn't matter. What matters is that Ridgeview remembers, the woods remember, and the story of the Ridgeview Four no longer ends in silence, but in truth. Painful, long awaited, and finally unburied.